And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Great to have back on Dr. Corey Miller. Dr. Miller, how are you doing this morning?
Doing great, and it's great to be back.
We wanted to circle back and talk about, just this small little problem that we should be able to solve here while we're talking, and that is the university. And I imagine most listeners are familiar with the progressive drift or maybe drive of many universities, and how so many Christian young people end up at these places and then either lose their faith, change their worldview. And so some Christians may say, well, let's just completely abandon them. But your ministry is working in this space. You've written a new book talking about the status of the university, the progressive miseducation of America. So that was the big idea for our time together today. If you're not familiar with Dr. Miller's work, he's the president and CEO of Ratio Christi, 2015 to the present. He grew up in Utah as a seventh-generation Mormon, came to Christ, and then since then has taught over 100 college courses in philosophy, theology, rhetoric, comparative religions. He's served with Cru and now holds several degrees. And I'm just so grateful for all of his work in the apologetics arena and helping talk about the goodness, the reasonableness of Christianity. Dr. Miller, if you would, maybe just jump in and share a recent success story, just maybe a way that God's been working through your ministry.
Sure. I was at the Purdue campus this week and met a man named Lewis, and he used to be an atheist, a PhD in biomedical engineering. He came to one of our events that really opened up his mind to be open-minded about the possibility of God. It created a plausibility structure for the Christian worldview. So he started meeting with the local chapter that meets weekly on campus for about 6 months, and he finally pulled the trigger, came to Christ, and now he tables on the campus with us about 3 times a week doing campus evangelism.
That's so encouraging. And one of the things I so appreciate about you is you're speaking all over the country. Your ministry is global in its reach, but I know right there in Lafayette, Indiana, you're doing this ministry day to day. So it's informed by actual ministry, not just kind of thinking, sitting somewhere thinking about it. You're doing it yourself, and so I so appreciate that about you. You share a little bit. I know we had talked back, and actually I was looking back. It's 2022. We were talking about apologetics, Christian worldview on the college campus, and knew a little bit about your background, but I did not capture everything about growing up as a seventh-generation Mormon, and even you have an interesting ancestor. So I'd be interested in learning a little bit more about that and what led you to Christ.
Yeah, that background is quite interesting to me, too, as someone who is interested in the history of ideas and history in general. My family says I come from healthy stock, and that's because the ancestor who was one of the bodyguards of Joseph Smith happened to be polygamous, took 5 wives, and fostered 36 children, of which I'm a descendant. So that's the healthy stock. But he was his home was right there next to Joseph Smith. I've been on the property in Nauvoo. And his father, who is the 7th gen, he's 6th gen, they split from one another as the very first and highest ever ranking split of Mormonism happened. There are 400 splinter groups since Joseph Smith's death, and my family participated in the first and the highest.
So you know something about church splits, okay?
But anyway,
I got that. Okay.
Yeah. But it was that background in Mormonism, and then getting introduced to really the biblical gospel that blew my mind, gave me a new lot on life, gave me an appreciation for grace, but then started to cause me to wonder about the authenticity of this new faith that I had come to believe, because I had always believed that the Bible was full of holes. It didn't matter because you had a living prophet. But after converting to biblical Christianity after a year, and then being challenged again by my Mormon family to go back and reread the Book of Mormon for the sake of truth and not just tradition after 7 generations, I did. Found it to be very problematic, but that's what made me wonder, okay, well, what about the Bible then? And how do I know it's reliable? How do I know God even exists? And if so, which God? And so that's what sent me into skepticism for a bit, and then eventually more confirmation about my Christian faith, and eventually to becoming a professor of philosophy and comparative religions at Indiana University and so forth. But, you know, about 11 years ago, that's when I got this opportunity to serve with Ratio Christi, which does a thoughtful Christianity, a reasonable faith kind of approach on campuses, on over 100 college campuses at the undergrad level. We have a high school division, we have a professor's division, and now we have what's sort of my pride and joy, our PhD student only division, where we are funding bright PhD students getting into R1 colleges to launch PhD student only ministries to develop a 40 or 50
Wow.
year pipeline to reclaim the
No,
universities
I
for
love
Christ.
this, and this is why we're talking about it. And that's really at the core of our podcast of trying to think about what do we do next. We can complain about how things are. We can note them, but then what are we going to do about it? I think as believers is so important.
Yeah.
And I'd love to learn a little bit more about the PhD program. I'm sure we'll get into that as we move forward. Well, I wanted to jump in on this new book that you've written. And as Christians, we have so many different things to think about. And for those that are listening, there may be some that are in the public university. They're really burdened for this. And so you do a great job of kind of setting all this out. But what led you specifically to write the book? You have a lot of traveling, a lot of things to do. So what led you to put pen to paper?
Well, I met with some probably mutual friends over a period of time, and we were reading primary literature on revolution. I sensed we are in a revolution in this country. I wanted to communicate the messaging about that stuff that I'd learned at Purdue as a philosopher and studying Marxism, getting published in Marxist thought there, and seeing what was happening coming down the pipeline very early on, a couple decades ago. But I also really needed to get something written that wasn't, say, on Mormonism. I have 3 books on that topic, contributing to my past. That's good for Utah, of course, or 2 books on philosophy, which is good for the 2 professors around the world who might read those academic books. I needed something that was more on the popular level, that's speaking broadly to culture. My new zest is on faith, reason, and the intersection of culture. I needed to have something where I could give a speaking platform and give greater visibility to my ministry, Ratio Christi, so that people could understand what it is. And that just morphed into, the whole industry needs to be promoted here for the solution for this problem we are facing. And then I just thought, the whole American church needs to be aware of this. And so really it's a book written to the American church to understand this is no longer grandma's America. What just happened to my country? How did it happen? Look no further than the universities. Well, didn't we start those? Yes, here's the history of how we lost them. And therein lies the clue as to how we can then respond and reclaim the culture by focusing on the universities. And I give a clarion call to pastors and parents and philanthropists and professors and teachers, donors, parachurches, and prayers, all hands on deck. It's the university ultimately, but we all need to prepare for what's coming out of the universities.
Maybe 10 years ago, there might need to be an argument made, connecting the dots in between kind of the ivory tower and the person in the pew. But I don't think we really have to do that anymore. And every pastor, every layperson, I'm sure, sees these ideas that started in the ivory tower. We're going to get to some of those. Now affect discipleship in the local church every single weekend. And so you can't just, I think, okay, we're going to completely abandon this part of American life because they are creating the moral, ideological foundations upon which the seed of the gospel lands. And so important. Well,
Yeah, no doubt. And I think, my mantra, the thesis in the book is maybe in Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But what happens in the university does not stay in the university. As goes the university, so goes the culture. As goes the U.S. university, so goes the world. And a lot of people will push back on me and say, no, the university is not the most influential institution shaping civilization. It's the church. And I say, really? Statistically, 30% of Americans go to church weekly. But if you want to say almost weekly, it's 39%. But exactly 39% of 18 to 24-year-olds are enrolled in college. If you go to church weekly, you get 52 sermons a year. You get 60 sermons in your first month as a freshman in college. who now has the ear of the next generation? And they don't really, people don't have a realization of the magnitude of how radical the university is right now.
I've certainly wrestled with this as a student pastor, and I'm sure the church leaders out there struggle with this as well. Yeah, you literally have one touch, and it may be just a few hours, and it is like pulling teeth to get people there. And then on the other hand, you have students literally paying to go receive all of these, sermons in a sense. So
Yeah.
that can be frustrating. Well, why don't we go back to the beginning in a sense, and some might be familiar with this history, but if you could just briefly talk about the history of the U.S. university and the very explicit Christian purposes of the university when they started.
Yeah, it's natural that we started the universities, first of all, because we have a worldview that begins with mind and not with matter. And the central purpose of life, according to Jesus, is to know God. So knowledge isn't something peripheral to the Christian worldview, it's central. So we started them in Europe, and then over in America, as soon as the Puritans landed, within a decade or two, they launched Harvard, whose motto was Veritas, or truth, quickly changing that to truth for Christ and the church for 300 years, from 1636 until 1936. And for the first 200 years, almost every every president of almost every college in the nation was also a member of the clergy, Protestant clergy in particular, the way it was historically developed. But up until 1880, church and chapel attendance were still required. So what happened was that we had no PhD programs in the United States, and so we sent our best and brightest over to Europe, Germany in particular, which was the most formally educated country in the history of the world at the time. But we think about, what was going on in the ideas centers there. You had Immanuel Kant. We remember him by "You Kant no ultimate reality," so that's agnosticism, I don't knowism. You had Schleiermacher, the father of modern liberal theology. You had Nietzsche, God is dead. You had Freud, sexuality merged with, we had Marx and Engels there. All of that stuff in Germany. And our best and brightest came back over to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, and so forth. And they took it over. It was a 50-year battle. They won. In the 1930s, we had to start all over with Westminster and Calvin and Biola and Taylor and Moody and Wheaton and things like that. They're all now experiencing cracks in the fissures because of Revolution number 2. And that is, again, in the 1930s, something nefarious was happening in Germany again, this time in the city of Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. So now we hear these terms: critical race theory, critical gender theory, critical pedagogy, critical queer theory, critical iceberg theory. If it's not critical thinking and it says critical in it, run, because it's Marx plus whatever else. Really a Marx-Freud synthesis. And that's why right here in Indiana, we have that nice statue of Alfred Kinsey at IU. That was helpful in the sexual revolution. But all of those founders there in that school had to get out of town when Hitler rose to power in 1933. Where did they go? Columbia, Brandeis, UCLA. And then right below them, I would call it the access powers of socialism, you had Antonio Gramsci, perhaps the most dangerous of all cultural Marxists. How dangerous? He never got out of prison. But he wrote the prison notes, and those prison notes got translated into the English-speaking world right here in Indiana at Notre Dame University, of all places, by a Marxist professor with the name Joseph Buttigieg, father of Mayor Pete. So Mayor Pete wasn't just advancing homosexuality. He had a good dose of critical queer theory, which has taken over into our divinity schools, like Yale Divinity School. They have a course called Queer Theology, Queering God now. And so, between the Axis powers in the North and in the South, and then within 15 years, the founders of postmodernism, French postmodern thought like Foucault and Derrida and Rorty and Lyotard, they all came over to America. They were all card-carrying members of the French Communist Party. And so it was this blend of postmodern cultural Marxism that came over to our best universities, and over decades and decades, Revolution number 2 went through the sexual revolution, got stopped a little bit. They had to be paused, and then launched for the long march through the institutions into the 70s. and it became highly radical in the last 25, 30 years when they have now taken over and pushed out the old guard, causing people like Richard Dawkins and friends now to want to be our friends.
And it's helpful, though, in some ways almost terrifying. The length of time that these ideas have been in play, and how an institution founded on truth can lead to, could end up with a course on querying God. That can happen, and so it's very concerning. Maybe if you dive into a little bit, you've kind of described where we are. How does that now contribute to miseducation in the university today? And also, how did that impact broader culture? So maybe kind of how do things stand today, 2026, and how have all these ideas impacted our culture?
Yeah, and so again, as I said, that what may happen in Vegas may stay in Vegas, not really, but what happens in the university was never intended to stay there. Ideas have consequences. Bad ones make victims, and good ones can transform lives and civilization for good. The first revolution, scientific naturalism, had the effect of giving us liberal Protestant theology, and it infiltrated into the churches by giving us the social gospel. They reigned for about 100 years, with the apex of that reign being the first 2 decades of this century, and that was Richard Dawkins and the New Atheists, who tried to guillotine all of religion, and Dawkins ended up getting guillotined by his own guillotine by the new Revolutionary Guard. That's why he wants to call himself a cultural Christian, and Elon Musk a cultural Christian, and why suddenly Democratic presidential candidates are now serving in the Republican cabinet, because the Democratic Party has been taken over by this. This is a revolution. It's not from America. It's not about liberal and conservative. It's illiberal, and a lot of people are sensing that now. And so this second guard is postmodern cultural Marxism. It began not in the hard sciences this time, but in the humanities and social sciences. But it jumped tracks over into, even at schools like Purdue, with engineering, which is one of the most conservative schools because the bridges need to stay up and 2 + 2 still equals 4 in engineering. But it jumped into engineering and into medicine and into mathematics through the DEI, or what I call DIE, administration. And those words, being good postmodernists, they have co-opted what were otherwise fine words, diversity, inclusivity, equity, in the past, and they have applied a Marxist meaning to those. And they started taking over the entire universities, and then went into the corporate world, into media, and then into ecclesia. And that was always the goal. When Antonio Gramsci talked about cultural Marxism, there was something about classical Marxism that could not get revolutionary like they could with Russia and China. They couldn't do it in the West, not in Western Europe and not in America. Why? Because there was this political society, which includes government and law enforcement and military, and then there's civil society, the soft tissue of culture, like academia and media and ecclesia, religion, church. And unless and until you ensconce yourselves effectively into those other strata of institutions, you're never going to be ready for a frontal assault. And so they talked about the long march through these institutions, and now that's what it's done, and it's gone into our seminaries, into our Christian academic societies, campus ministries, and churches. The barbarians no longer at the gates, they're in the citadel, and the effect has been to give us not the social gospel, but social justice, which is often injustice, in order to foment and create this revolution. And they've been successful in many quarters, especially with Christians, because we believe in original sin. And we believe God hates sin and God hates oppression. And somehow we came to believe that sin just is oppression, and God is love and love is love, like water is water, whether it comes from the tap or the toilet, right? No, love means something, but they've co-opted all these words. So even in churches, They're no longer mercy ministries or compassion ministries. They're called justice ministries. That should be a clue that something is going on there. So we are in a soft revolution in this country. It's the effect of the second ideological revolution in the universities. And so I'm calling for a third ideological revolution, but giving a clarion call then to figure out how to go back into the universities, because politics is downstream from culture, Josh, culture from education, and the apex of education is the universities. We can pull up dump trucks to the cesspool of maybe politics downstream and get clear sight to the bottom of the pond for the first time in how long? It's only going to last for 15 seconds because that's downstream. You got to solve what's upstream, and that's the university. And even if you're not called to go there, you need to know what's coming from there in order to prepare for what's coming downstream.
So the place I'm sitting, if those are watching on the video, I'm not in my normal studio, but in we call them a Zoom booth at the Indiana State House. And here, just a few years ago, the legislature finally defunded the Kinsey Institute. We've talked about the Kinsey Institute on the podcast before, one of the pioneers of the sexual revolution, and not allegedly, but in his own publications, was talking about sexual experiments on minors. I mean, just unbelievable things. And yet there, as you mentioned, a statue to him on the university campus unveiled pretty recently. And so government is always kind of struggling to deal with ideology, like you said, downstream. It is an important institution, but we certainly feel that keenly, even where I'm sitting here, as those in authority. Like, what in the world's being taught to our Hoosier kids? Like, we thought we're a conservative place, and what's being taught over there? So this is certainly one example of that. I wanted to double click a little bit what you said about churches, and with the use of words, and it's one of the challenges that I found is it's hard to push back on a movement that has no qualms with changing the meanings of words. And so you think you've got one down, and then they changed again. And or using kind of our Christian sensibilities to actually move people to support causes that aren't biblical. So maybe could you work in this space a lot? Could maybe you help maybe a pastor as they're thinking through this? Do you have any kind of particular examples? You mentioned kind of the advocacy ministry that then just kind of throws out government's role altogether and just focuses on, say, like a Matthew 25 concern for people. But any other kind of red flags or thoughts for church leaders as they're navigating what's happened?
I mean, because the rhetoric, again, the postmodern brilliance is to take language and shape culture through the redefining of terms. And so love, for example, and to co-opt, Jesus even. And God is love is love. Do you have your rainbow flag up in your church yet, or in your Christian coffee shop, which is happening here in this area in West Lafayette? And so churches start to capitulate, and families too, because now, there are more trans middle school kids suddenly overnight than there are middle school kids in existence. Obvious hyperbole there, but what happens is they come in and they use the rhetorical discourse that they're learning online or from peers coming from these think tanks, ultimately through TikTok or wherever else. But, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, would you rather have a living son or a dead daughter? You choose. And so the Christian parent, being ill-equipped, often because of ill-equipping in the churches, don't know how to handle it, and just to hold on to a shoestring to that relationship, they end up moving into a progressive situation. So, Mark Knoll wrote the book over 30 years ago called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And on page 1, he told us what the scandal was, and it was that there isn't much of an evangelical mind. We have excommunicated the life of the mind. We have embraced the heart of Christ and the hands of Christ at the expense of the head of Christ. And we need to be about repentance now. When Jesus was challenged by the Sadducees, he took them on, and then the Pharisees came on and said, "Teacher, tell us, impress us, what's the greatest command?" "Love God with all your heart, soul, and heart." "No, heart, soul, and mind." And he said that the purpose to life is to know God. And we need to be prepared to give a reason for the hope that's in us and do it with gentleness and respect. So we've got the head, the heart, and the hands there. But the Christian church has literally lost its mind in the last century, abdicated our right and responsibility in high culture because we failed to love God with our mind. And we are living with this menace of mindless Christianity. And so whenever you do worldview surveys to figure out how many Americans actually embraced a biblical worldview, in 2022, it came out that it was 6%. A year later, 4%. Among pastors, it was 37%. But among evangelical pastors, it was 51 to 57%. And we're supposed to be excited about that, like it's a touchdown. That's the problem. Many of our churches are being, accosted by fads like skinny jeans and fog machines on Sunday mornings and getting our goods from sociology and culture rather than theology and scripture and good Christian thought. But this is very subtle philosophy that has come from academia into media and into even into ecclesia and into the churches. And when people try to say, well, where should I send my kid? Or right now we're just going to send them all to the Christian schools. Look, this is a major problem. They targeted the colleges of education primarily. My daughter is a junior in the College of Education as elementary ed at Purdue. And I look at every one of her syllabi for her classes, and I can see this stuff embedded there at one of the more conservative schools. So let's say she didn't have a person with 4 graduate degrees that can sniff this stuff out like me. And she's going to go teach in a K through 12 Christian school down the road. What are the chances she's going to take that stuff from the university and flush it right into the Christian schools? This is why pastors need to understand what's going on. Parents are both working. It's hard. You're exhausted. But parents and grandparents are literally paying for the apostasy of their own children if we don't start to wake up and understand
That's why
what's
I wanted to
happening.
have you on, and can't recommend your book enough for us to see the development of those things and to know the kind of catchphrases, the things that should raise a red flag. And in all of this, really, our standard is the Word of God, and pushing people towards knowing Him, like you said, understanding reality according to Scripture and a biblical worldview. And even, as you mentioned, even our Christian institutions can be impacted by these ideas. And so we need to be vigilant on that. So I wanted to just go a little bit deeper on that as we try to lead institutions, whether it's a church, Christian school, etc. Well, I wanted to turn now to what can we do? All right, so you've mentioned kind of our 2 revolutions. You think, and I'm grateful for this. I try to be an optimist as well, at least a hopeful realist, is that there is a 3rd revolution possible. And as we get into this, I was grateful your organization has gone to the mat in a few places just to be able to be there. Right? I thought this kind of underlines where we are and the importance of pushing back. And so would you describe a couple of successful legal actions that your ministry had to take even to be present?
Yeah, and in one of the parts of the book, in the end, I give a clarion call to political allies too. I'm so thankful for the politicians and lawyers that have helped keep the lights on for us, keep the platform open for us. My concluding chapter is MAGA and the morning after. Can America be made great again if it's not made good again? And I say no. But nonetheless, I am grateful for our political allies to help us go in and do heart and mind surgery in the universities. So, since I've been here for 11 years, we've had probably 160 legal inquiries, 4 federal victories, 5 appellate court victories, 2 SCOTUS assists, and we gave Biden a going away present for the Department of Education victory just before he left office. At any one time, I've got 3 to 6 situations happening at some university around the country. And it's because they, these universities, they want our tuition dollars and our children, but they do not want our ideas. And they know where the battlefield really lies, and that is at the gatekeeping place of ideas, and that's the university. So they're intent to try to marginalize or to keep Christians out or from coming in. And so that's why I think it's important that we focus, we stay focused, we take care of our families and our congregations and be equipped to tell our coworkers about what's going on and advance the cause of Christ this way. but we need to keep all eyes on the university. That's the prize. The Marxists, if they can gain access and if they can win the revolution in America, then they gain the world.
So, thinking about this third revolution, what are some ways that Christians can practically engage? You mentioned this PhD program. I'm interested in learning more about that. But then this is why I'm grateful to know you, that you've thought about this. What is the strategy? Let's not just throw our hands up and say, well, they took them over, so forget it. And we have our parallel organizations that face the same struggles, but it's like for us, the public schools in a state or even in the country. I am a huge proponent, champion of Christian education. I also know that 90% of our kids in the state of Indiana go to a public school, so you can't abandon it. But that seems to have been the strategy maybe over the last 20, 30 years is it's going to go the way it's going to go. We'll build parallels. So what is, kind of the strategy? How are you thinking about what do we do to take things back?
Yeah. Yeah, this is where I say, look, throw socks on a wall. If other people are doing research and development and have something successful, great. But we cannot just keep starting over and acquiescing and abdicating our heritage. We did that with Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. We're now seeing the cracks and the fissures at Biola and Wheaton and Calvin. Well, Calvin's gone. In many of our Christian institutes from the second revolutionary ideology. What are we going to do? Where are we going to retreat to? Are we going to start all over and have a $100,000 endowment with an Atari computer compared to Harvard with $52 billion endowment, which is more than half the country's GDP in existence out there in the world? No, we need to learn from the Marxists about the long march through the institutions, and we need to do institutional recapture. And so one of the things that we've developed is this Malik Academic Fellowship. Charles Malik gave a lecture 40 years ago at Wheaton. He was the UN Secretary General. He was the senior architect behind the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And he likewise, instead of one of the crazies coming from Germany in the 30s, he was one of the good guys from the 30s. He went to the U.S., went to Harvard, finished his PhD in philosophy, and has about 50 honorary doctorates. He's now passed away, but he talked about the two tasks, redeeming the soul and redeeming the mind, where the mind of culture is the university. And so we call it the Malik Academic Fellowship, and we fund Christian PhD students to get into top 100 universities because that will guarantee them jobs on the job market, but it'll also plant chapters where we are focused strategically on training up a generation of PhD students every single year for decades out to 40 or 50 years on what it means to be not just a professor who happens to be a Christian, but a Christian professor, a missional professor, and we're going to get them when they're young, train them up in the way they should go, and when they get older, they're not going to depart from it, and they're going to help us reclaim the universities. If your audience wants to help fund any of those, it does take funding to do that. Contact me. Look at our website. If you want to get your kids involved on campuses where Ratio Christi exists, doing apologetics evangelism and science and philosophy and history, giving reasons to believe, look at our website, see where we're at. If you want to invite me out, I'm on a 12 to 18 month speaking tour on my book, The Progressive Miseducation of America, for a campus, for a retreat, men's retreat, churches, or conferences. And then finally, Josh, we have a product line. A lot of people are busy. You may not have time to read Steve Meyer's, 500-page book tome on intelligent design and how we can know that God created the world. But we had Steve give us that in 25 pages at the 11th grade reading level. We have 60 of these booklets by some of the brightest Christian minds in everything from the problems of science and scripture and why God allows evil to now everything like race, class, sex, gender, ethnicity, and so forth. And in these categories, everybody writing has a PhD, but they also had to be former trans, former gay, former black, and even current black. Get that. If it's like Christianity, is it a white man's religion, right? Because people value the lived experience in these categories. And so we go out there and write a booklet on feminism. We're going to find someone who is a former feminist who not only has a PhD, but lived the life. So We've got resources on our website. These are absolutely free. If people just put their email address on there, receive our monthly propaganda. They're digital, they're printable. You can get them into your youth groups, into your Bible studies. Your pastors can get equipped, parents can get equipped. Equip yourselves for what's coming out of the universities, or don't bother 18 years training your child and saving up money for college. Just give them away
And
now.
that's why it's difficult always when we're trying to choose a podcast topic. Dr. Miller, it's like, well, all those booklets are so great and they're all very timely. So I did want to recommend that. We'll link to all of the things you mentioned in the show notes if listeners are interested. I did want to turn, just because you are on college campuses, you're doing these tours, Ask Me Anything, which has to be a little nerve-wracking as you go in. Just throw it at me, whatever you got, all right? Maybe just one or two topics or things that you've been thinking about recently on the goodness and truth, the reasonableness of Christianity. What's kind of top of mind as you're having these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think the old apologetics, the classical view is fighting against Richard Dawkins and science and things like that. But the new guard is really about not whether Christianity is true, but whether it's good. Christianity is viewed as oppressive, as wicked, as hateful, as harmful. And so we need to have a cultural apologetic that addresses the cultural moment. And that is talking about, still, is Christianity true and is it reasonable, but is it even good? And so that's one of the lectures that I'm giving a lot around the country is Christianity good or bad for the world? Looking at everything from the rise of education in the universities, which we started, and the sciences, to the hospital movements and compassion and things like that, which likewise we started. Most hospitals even have the name of some religious denomination, including a checks and balances government, which we started, and including things like free market economics, which again, we started and come out of the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So there is a lot to show that Christianity is good for the world, not just for the next world, but for this world. And I think that's why we are seeing the possible rebirth of Christianity and interest in our culture, and why Richard Dawkins wants to be called a cultural Christian, and Elon Musk and Jordan Peterson, an existentialist Christian, and Ian Hersey Ali even converted and became an actual Christian. Why? Because for the first time in a long time, we have been now seeing what this revolution would look like. It's no longer just abstract ideas. And we have a comparison. Do I want Islamicism? Do I want Marxism? Or do we want to reconsider the Christian fruits of Western civilization? The problem is you can't have the fruit without the root. And that's where we come in to give Christian apologetics and reasons for our faith.
How do you see the technological revolution that's happening surrounding artificial intelligence? And I know you've done a lot of work on this as well, but just maybe how those changes might impact higher education and this third revolution that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the education is changing and is certainly going to change. Nonetheless, the motto is still there that politics downstream from culture, culture from education, and the apex might be the university right now, it might be something else later, but it's education. Hitler allegedly said, "Give me the textbooks and I will control Germany." And he did. And Abraham Lincoln, the philosophy in the classroom today becomes the philosophy of government in the next. So whatever is our next classroom motto, we want to be innovative in thinking about that. We need to be upstream, though, with education. Ideas matter. Ideas have consequences. Bad ones have victims, and good ones transform lives, societies, and civilization.
Hey, coming a blitz round here. Maybe speak to students that are considering a public university. Of course, we encourage a number of kids to go to Christian school if that's available. There may be, in-state tuition, financial reasons, or even a particular field they feel called to go into, and they're headed off into a secular university. What encouragement would you give to them? And also maybe speak to those parents, youth pastors, also trying to think of maybe it's the senior year. You don't want to pay for the apostasy of your child. So maybe some encouragement for those folks.
Yeah, I mean, we do RC College Prep, which is designed to help students to think about not just surviving, but thriving when they arrive at university. Churches can adopt those and have a chapter in their church. The booklets, again, parents who want to engage their son or daughter on some of these hot topics that they are going to face. I mean, when they get to the university, right now the ratio of liberal to conservative is 12 to 1 at retirement age. It's 23 to 1 for those who just got tenure and have 30 years
Wow.
ahead of them. And it's 70 to 1 in some fields like religious studies. In Yale and their social sciences and humanities, it's 78 to 1. So do not think your kids will not be impacted when they get there. Either they get equipped or they don't, and there's no in between. So I would encourage them to consider two things. When you go off to college, there is frat row on Friday nights. Everybody wants to party. Everybody's doing it. Even the proverbial Christian kids are doing it. And so those who are resisting are doing it because of their convictions. But after they've gotten 60 sermons that first month, their freshman year, from ideologues that have subverted their Christian confidence in their faith, Friday night looks more and more attractive. Get involved in a good campus ministry and be prepared for the assault that's going to come and the temptations. But you've got to study even the campus ministries, because you go woke, you go broke, and some of them have been infiltrated now, just like some of our seminaries have been. And so the parents, it's always been on the parents. Do not hand them over to the youth pastor. That was a practical need, like the rise of deacons, for a purpose. And it was because now there were homes that didn't have Christian parents. Somehow we as the Christian church went ahead and said, well, maybe we can just give the youth pastor our kids too, and then just raise them for the first 18 years, and then we'll pay for their college. No, the biblical model is parents are responsible for their kids. If you don't get it, and if you're having a hard time and you don't have a lot of time, that's why we have these resources, these booklets, so that you can have bite-sized chunks at the 11th grade reading level on a plethora of different topics. Equip yourselves. There's no getting around this. Someone asked me yesterday in a podcast, so what do you say to the Christians? I said one word: repent. We need to start loving God with our mind. We've had enough time with the menace of mindless Christianity. We don't need to be intellectuals. We simply need to love God with our mind, our hands, our heart, and our heads. We've got the resources. They're available. You are going to face this. Your kids are going to face this, and you are going to lose them if you don't equip them.
Well, so appreciate you being on. We've been doing kind of a series throughout the beginning of 26, just thinking about the 250th anniversary of the United States, and thinking back on our history, but also looking towards the future with some sense of hope and purpose. And it certainly strikes me that if that future is going to be bright, we've got to fix this system. So I'm so grateful that God's called you into it. I've asked you a battery of questions as we come to a close. Anything else, and even maybe just a summary statement to the audience that you'd like to encourage them to think about?
Yeah, again, just that zinger. What happens in the universities doesn't stay in the universities. As go the universities, so goes the culture. As goes the U.S. university, so goes the world. There's a lot to be afraid of because of what's happening at the universities right now, but there's so much opportunity. 1 in 3 world leaders, presidents, prime ministers, dictators, whatever, 1 in 3 earned an academic degree at a U.S. university. This is ground zero. You want to get the biggest bang out of your buck, the university is the mission field for the world. And it is also the place we need to really address the issue upstream for what is hitting us downstream. So a lot of good things happening, a lot of bright spots, a lot of people getting saved. There is a spiritual interest happening right now in our culture, perhaps the Charlie Kirk effect or whatever. We're seeing a lot of students come to Christ on the campuses right now. So there are bright spots, but there is danger. We are in a battle. America is in a revolution.
Again, thank you so much for your very unique ministry. We'll be praying for that. We'll link to the show notes, and just thank you for taking the time to join us. And maybe I can catch one of these speaking tours, but just grateful for your work.
Yeah, go team, go God. Thank you.